So when we think about what it means to be anti-racist, there are a lot of different ways that folks are in conversation about this right now. And I really want to make sure that there's clarity for us when we're talking about what it means to be an organization and have an institution that's committed to being anti-racist. What does that look like for us? So we want to make sure that people are clear and have an opportunity to get some ideas about where your organization might be on its journey towards becoming an anti-racist organization. And so I want to take a little bit of time to talk about a continuum of anti-racist, continuum towards being an anti-racist organization. There are 6 kind of spaces where folks might live, and I want to acknowledge that. And I want to acknowledge that you may be a little bit in different places as an organization. But as we talk through this, I just want folks to be listening and kind of starting to think about, where am I? Where's my organization? How do I see my organization showing up here in this continuum? So we're going to zoom in on each. So the first place that we think about on the continuum is an exclusionary organization. And so this is an organization that is openly maintaining a white dominant group, right? So they're centering white folks. White folks are the main folks who are present in the conversations. Might even be the case that it's white men or things like that, right? Like a group with the most power in society is the group whose voice, attitude, culture, norms are being centered in the space. There is overt and explicit exclusion and discrimination. Harassment can be experienced by folks who are not of that identity, and folks are maybe also experiencing hostility. These environments are often unsafe for BIPOC folks and folks who are marginalized along other identities as well, right? So when we think of an exclusionary organization, exclusionary place, we might be thinking of it would look like this, right? An organization that has a culture that looks like this. The next one I want to talk a little bit about is the club. And so in the club, when your institution is here on the spectrum, really like white folks are the dominant group who is maintaining kind of traditionally held power and influence. So thinking about white folks are in leadership and decision-making positions. White folks are the folks who most inform decision-making that is happening at the organization. So thinking about, if we think about our institutions, are the funders who we're in conversation with most often white folks? Are the board members of our organization most often white folks? Thinking kind of along those lines, right? So not just who is in the decision-making roles, but who's also influencing how decision-making is happening at the organization. White dominant culture and policies and procedures are viewed as the right way of doing things, right? So I think it's important. I love this little comic because it really kind of illustrates this point for me. And I think about children a lot when I think about this, right? When we're teaching our kids, when we're helping them to like get accustomed to things, a lot of times we start to see our own norms and those types of things and the ways that we think about what's the right way, what's the normal way, what's the appropriate way. And so I'm just going to share a short anecdote here. I have a 3-year-old who about 6 months ago started saying, we try to use about 4 different languages in my family, trying to kind of have a wider spectrum of conversation. And so my kid's exposed to Japanese, Spanish, English, and American Sign Language. And about 6 months ago, my kid started saying, I want you to talk regular. Please speak regular. And I was like, what does that mean? What are you saying when you say speak regular? And so we had to have several conversations about it. And what had been normalized for my child is English. That to them was regular. And so when I would speak Spanish or try and practice ASL with them, I would get this response of, please speak regular. Can you speak regular? And so we had to have some moments of like processing that. What does that mean that English has become the language that's normalized, right? So just as an example of like the types of ways that we are thinking about what's right or what's normal, what's regular, right? And we'll talk about interventions in a while, and I'll get back to the story about my child when we get there. This is also in kind of the club space. There's a limited number of folks who are BIPOC who are allowed in, and only when they have the right credentials, attitudes, or behaviors. So really when they are, if and only when they are assimilating to white cultural norms, right? So thinking about the club as that. And I'm gonna pass the baton to Krystal to take us through the next two.
Thank you. So we're now looking at a compliance organization. So this, in a compliance organization, there's still a white dominant group and culture. There's still what is normal, what is regular, right? And some BIPOC folks might be allowed into the organization or might be hired into the organization, but it doesn't change the org itself, right? So this might be perhaps there's white folks in those key decision-making places that Povi-tamu described earlier, and there are BIPOC folks who are managing programs, directing programs, program coordinators in these places where they might be in positions to do some of the work. However, it might not have the positions that allow them to change structures, systems, have decision-making power. BIPOC must assimilate to the org culture, meaning that if they are in those positions, there are channels that they are appropriate to get that stuff done, right? So BIPOC might be thinking that might look like having a BIPOC leader. So BIPOC, I don't know if we said this already, but it's Black, Indigenous, People of Color. That's the abbreviation. So someone who identifies as such, you know, in order to get funding for their idea or approval of their idea, they're presenting to the board in a very specific way, right? So with these very specific metrics, the way that it's always been done. So they're there and they're following procedure. They're doing what it takes to be compliant with the organizational culture and what's normal. These organizations might have a race neutral approach. So that means, you know, we don't think about color at all. Everybody who is qualified enters, right? Or everyone who is qualified is considered in these different ways. Not recognizing that a race neutral approach is normalizing marginalization and minimizing the fact that there is difference and that BIPOC folks do have different sets of experiences that need to be taken into account. So that is a compliance organization, someone who is kind of going through some of the work in sense of saying, we do enough, right? We do enough. Now we're looking at an affirming organization. An affirming organization is not a bad organization. They've shared commitment to eliminating discrimination, maybe broadly, maybe haven't necessarily said the words racism for a while or ableism or any specific oppressions, but have decided that they are definitely committed to ending discrimination. There are statements perhaps that go out occasionally, depending on the time. Some cultural differences are acknowledged. So there might be heritage months, there might be employee groups, right? They're acknowledged and celebrated. However, there might be others that are completely overlooked. So even in the case of there being heritage group and employee groups, you might always have Christmas break, not recognizing that Christmas is not necessarily something that would be acknowledged by everybody, right? Or that invites everybody's diverse celebrations. So recognizing that there's still this underlying dominant culture, and although other folks are here and are celebrated, they're not necessarily breaking into these strong foundational cultures. There's an active effort to recruit and hire and support BIPOC folks. So that could be mentorship programs, that could be specific recruitment strategies, maybe from certain colleges, things like that. Staff receive diversity trainings, maybe that are not informed by staff need or by specific BIPOC in the organization, but are kind of standard diversity trainings. And still BIPOC are asked to assimilate to white dominant culture. Again, in positions they're there, not necessarily shifting foundational culture.
Thanks, Krystal. I'm going to circle back just because we had a question about unpacking the difference between the club and the compliance, and I just want to make sure that feels clear for folks. So yes, one of the big distinguishers between club and compliance is access of Black, Indigenous, and people of color to the institution or space, right? So you will see more Black, Indigenous, and people of color in the organization when it's a compliance organization compared to when it's a club organization. And I just want to elevate as a distinction the club space is also it continues to normalize whiteness in a hyper way, if I can say it that way, right? So if you think about who's visible, what's valued, those types of things, that will feel more alive in a club organization around whiteness. Then you'll feel that moving a little further along in the compliance space. So I'm going to continue. We want to get to an organization that's in the process of redefining. And so this is an organization that has shifted to be much more intentional about its process for hiring, recruiting, retaining, and developing BIPOC at all levels in the organization. So thinking about Black and Indigenous people from entry level positions in the organization to leadership positions within the organization, and really being thoughtful about what our needs. And some of that thoughtfulness may look like not just doing things like exit interviews, but actually taking the learnings from those exit interviews, especially from folks who have left the organization who are BIPOC people, to see what do we need to shift? What are some of the themes that have come up? That sort of thing. That's what we mean when we're talking about intentionality. What types of investment do we need to make in professional development, or in support systems, or creating peer networks, or supporting our folks to use some of their work time to engage in peer networks, right? That sort of intentionality is what we're talking about. And really, in the redefining space, an organization is starting to use a race equity lens to manage the entire organization. So thinking about how from our internal practices, our structures, our systems, and our culture, are we thinking about racial equity? How is racial equity alive in our organization? To thinking about in our programming, how is racial equity a priority and alive in our organization? So really using that lens and having that lens become a key way that we're assessing and learning as our organizations are growing and developing. In the redefining space, an organization is also creating spaces in an ongoing way for conversation on race. So it's not a one-time moment like we talked about in the Affirming, where it's like we might do annual diversity trainings, right? No, we've created spaces for race conversations around race, experience of marginalization to happen in ongoing ways. This might mean if you have one-on-one check-ins, you dedicate at least one a month of your check-ins with folks to talk about how are things moving, how are things feeling, how are things looking, how is our racial equity lens being applied well or not, based on what you're experiencing, right? And then we want to highlight that in this place, also an organization is really focusing on engaging and empowering all staff to think about how are we redesigning our policies, our practices, our services, and our programs, right? So we'll close out with an equitable organization. So this is an organization that really is reflecting, right? So what we see from the organization, what folks are experiencing, so internally and externally, are centering the contributions and interests of BIPOC folks, and really the organization is active and is acting on its commitment to racial equity and inclusion, again, both internally and externally. The organization has acknowledged and continues to acknowledge institutional and systemic factors that are contributing to people's experiences of racial marginalization and oppression, and experiences of racialized privilege, right? And is actively doing work to promote equity and inclusion in the organization. So this looks like really understanding with our vendors, with our partners, amongst our staff and on our team, what are the ways that our organization itself has institutionalized things that have contributed to people's experiences of marginalization and supported people's experiences of privilege, and what are we doing to undo that and to map out a different practice, a different procedure or a different policy, right? In organizations that are equitable, it is the norm, it is expected that you will see BIPOC folks in leadership positions and are as decision makers. So there's a commitment to that. It's visible in the organization. These are our folks are able to lead the trajectory and set the course for the organization. Both, and again, like we're thinking about folks who are on your management teams and those executive level positions, also thinking about decision making, what your board makeup is comprised of, those types of things. And then this is an organization where BIPOC folks also feel able to show up fully as themselves, like with agency. So I can, from things that might be, that might seem like smaller everyday things, like I can feel free as a Black person to wear a natural hairstyle at the organization and know that I'm not gonna receive comments on it. I'm not gonna be told that I'm unprofessional or that I look XYZ kind of way. And that's my expectation. That's the norm. So from like smaller things around like how I wear my hair to bigger things like talking about dynamics in our communities and not feeling like we are going to be pathologized as racially marginalized folks in doing that. So across the spectrum, able to express themselves authentically.